September 3, 1260. A Mamluk general named Baybars presses his heels into his horse's flanks and stares at the dusty horizon ahead. Behind him, 12,000 warriors, men who were once slaves, captured in the steppes of Central Asia and forged into something the world had never seen. In front of him, 20,000 Mongol cavalrymen, the heirs to the greatest conquering empire humanity had ever known. The men who had destroyed Baghdad. The men who had turned entire cities into fields of ash. The men no army on earth had been able to stop. But Baybars wasn't afraid. He was waiting. Because Baybars knew something no other general on earth knew at that moment. He knew the ground beneath his feet. He knew the psychology of the enemy before him. And he knew the tactic the Mongols used to destroy every army that dared to face them, because he had grown up in the exact same world they had. He had learned in the same crucible of steppe warfare. What happened in that valley on that September day changed the course of history. It wasn't a victory of brute force. It wasn't a miracle. It was a plan meticulous, daring, and surgical. And the weapon that stopped the deadliest horde in the world was something no one saw coming. This isn't the history you think you know. Stick around until the end, because every layer we're about to peel back will change how you understand this battle. For over 40 years, the Mongols had never lost a pitched battle. 40 years. Let that sink in. We're not talking about a winning streak against weak or poorly equipped armies. We are talking about the most devastating record of military conquest in recorded history. A war machine that had steamrolled over China, Persia, Russia, Poland, Hungary, Afghanistan, and Iraq. Every single civilization that dared to resist had been erased. The Jin dynasty in China, which had dominated East Asia for centuries, destroyed. The Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad, the intellectual and spiritual center of the Islamic world for 500 years, wiped off the map in 1258. The Persian cities of Merv, Nishapur, Herat reduced to ruins and bone. The Russian armies, renowned for their ferocity, torn to shreds on the banks of frozen rivers. European heavy cavalry, the most feared military force in the West, broken, humiliated, and driven out of Poland and Hungary in 1241. None of them had succeeded. No army in the world had found an answer to the Mongols. And it wasn't just military might that made the Mongols terrifying. It was what they did before they even arrived. The stories traveled faster than the horses. Tales of cities that had resisted and been completely decimated, not just the soldiers, but the entire population. Tales of skulls piled in pyramids outside shattered walls. Tales of Mongol generals deliberately letting survivors flee, not out of mercy, but so those people would carry the terror to the next city, breaking their will to resist before the battle even began. The psychology of terror was a weapon as real as the Mongol arrow. In 1260, when the armies of the Mongol Ilkhanate, the western branch of the empire, led by Hulagu Khan, marched toward the Mediterranean after sacking Damascus, the Islamic world was in an existential panic. There was no longer any question of whether the Mongols would keep going. The question was when they would reach Egypt. And once they reached Egypt, what was going to stop them from sweeping across all of North Africa? What was going to stop them from crossing into Europe from the south? No one had stopped the Mongols. No one knew how. But there was a hidden weapon in the world in that year of 1260. A weapon the Mongols didn't expect. One that didn't appear on any list of catapults or archers or heavy cavalry. The tool that would bring the most relentless war machine in history to a grinding halt was far from obvious. But to understand what this weapon was, you first need to understand exactly what had to be overcome. Because only when you understand the machine can you understand the genius required to break it. The Mongols weren't just fast riders with bows. That would be like saying surgery is just cutting with a knife. Mongol military doctrine was a comprehensive system, integrated, adaptable, brutally efficient, and at the core of that system was a maneuver that had destroyed army after army, generation after generation, a maneuver so lethal that, for decades, no commander on Earth had managed to counter it. The feigned retreat. It works like this. The Mongol army faces the enemy in open field. The two sides engage. And then, in the middle of the battle, the Mongols begin to pull back, seemingly in panic, seemingly in defeat. The Mongol riders turn their horses and flee, but in a way that looks chaotic enough to be real. It looks like the breaking of a battle line. And this is exactly where every army that ever faced the Mongols made the same fatal mistake. Because when you see the enemy run, the instinct is to chase. It's not just a matter of tactics, it's basic human psychology. The sight of a retreating enemy triggers something primal in a warrior's brain. You're winning. Now is the time to finish it. And so, armies would break their formations and surge forward in pursuit. Heavy cavalry, foot archers, infantry, all abandoning their coordinated defensive positions to chase after what looked like a victory. And that is exactly when the Mongols wanted you to make your move. Because the retreat was controlled. The Mongol riders were agile enough to maintain a precise distance from their pursuers, far enough to avoid being caught, but close enough to keep the enemy running. And as they rode, the Mongol archers would turn in their saddles and fire backwards. This was called the Parthian shot, shooting backwards. The rider would twist his torso completely while galloping at full speed, aiming over the horse's flank towards the pursuer, releasing the bowstring at the exact instant the animal had all four hooves suspended in the air. The single moment without the vibration of hoof impacts. A skill that required years of training since childhood, and which Mongol archers executed with lethal precision even in genuine flight. The pursuing army, scattered across open terrain, its formation broken, would start taking casualties. But they kept pushing forward because it looked like they were winning, until the flanking wings appeared. While the central force feigned retreat, Mongol units that had been hiding on the flanks or on high ground would close in from both sides. The pursuing army, spread out and with its formation broken, suddenly found itself surrounded. No cohesion, no defensive line, no coordination, and the Mongol arrows rained down from every direction. It was a trap, and it worked every single time. The reason it worked every time is profound. Any army that relied on formation for its strength, and every medieval military force relied on formation, became vulnerable the moment that formation broke. European heavy cavalry, for instance, was devastating in an organized charge. But on its own, scattered in pursuit, it was just a heavy knight on a slow horse being trailed by a light rider who could shoot with pinpoint accuracy. The strength of the European army vanished the moment you made it give chase. The Mongols knew this, and they built an entire military doctrine around making the enemy chase them. But the feigned retreat didn't work in isolation. It was just the tip of a larger system. What made it nearly impossible to withstand was that the Mongols combined it with a speed no conventional army could match. A Mongol rider would cover distances that would make a European general think the measurements were wrong. Mongol logistics were based on multiple horses per warrior. Each soldier had 2, 3, sometimes 4 remounts, rotating between them to maintain the marching pace. This meant the Mongols arrived at the battlefield well-rested, while the enemy was still organizing its vanguard. It meant the feigned retreat could be sustained over distances that exhausted the pursuers without tiring those fleeing. and it meant that when the flanking wings closed in, they hit already exhausted enemies at full speed. Add to this the deliberate psychological warfare, burning cities visible from afar, refugees driven ahead to sow chaos in the next towns, messengers demanding immediate surrender with meticulous descriptions of what happened to those who refused, and you had a system of war operating on multiple levels simultaneously. Before the first Mongol rider even appeared on the horizon, the enemy was already partially defeated from within. No military force had cracked this puzzle. But the solution existed, hidden in the last place the Mongols would ever think to look. The destruction of Baghdad in 1258 had shown the world what happened when the Mongols met no real resistance. The Abbasid Caliphate, with 500 years of continuity, holding the greatest libraries of the known world, serving as the spiritual heart of Islam, destroyed in 18 days. Caliph al-Mustasim was executed. The rivers around Baghdad ran red for days. Accounts from the time describe the smoke being visible from unimaginable distances. To the Islamic world, Baghdad wasn't just a city. It was the very symbol that a civilization existed, and the Mongols had erased it. After that, Damascus fell. The Levant was in Mongol hands. The Crusader states, huddled on the coast, watched in absolute dread, running the numbers on whether it was better to cooperate with the Mongols than to resist. And the Mongols kept pushing south, towards Egypt, towards the Mamluks. And inside Egypt, there was something the Mongols weren't expecting. Not a larger army, not higher walls, something far more dangerous than any of those. A general who knew that very tactic inside out and knew exactly how to turn it against them. To understand what made the Mamluks so extraordinary that September in 1260, you need to understand who they were, not what the history books sometimes say about them. Egyptian warriors? Soldiers of the Sultan? No. To understand the Mamluks, you have to go to the steppes of Central Asia, to the exact same world that had produced the Mongols. Mamluk means slave, but not in the sense of a farmhand or a house servant. The Mamluk system was unparalleled in medieval military history. A warrior aristocracy deliberately forged from young boys captured or bought from the steppe tribes. Cumans, Kipchaks, Turks, the very same plains people who had birthed the Mongol psychology and culture of war. When a young boy from the steppes, say, a 10 or 11-year-old Cuman was captured or sold and became a Mamluk, he wasn't simply put to work. He was trained, systematically, for years. Horse archery, formation maneuvers, terrain reading, combat psychology. The exact same skill set that steppe children learned from the moment they could ride, but now refined, institutionalized, turned into formal military doctrine. And because the Mamluks came from the same steppe world as the Mongols, they brought something no European army, no Persian army, no Arab force could possibly possess: an instinctive understanding of the enemy. Not an academic understanding, studied in books. A visceral, cultural, embodied understanding. They knew how a steppe warrior thinks. They knew what a Mongol cavalryman does when he sees an enemy line break. They knew what a feigned retreat looks like from the inside, not just how it looks to the person being deceived, but how the maneuver actually feels when you execute it. And here's the element that most history books oversimplify. The Mamluks didn't just learn these skills in war school. They lived them. The Mamluk system built an entire identity around the cavalry warrior. It wasn't a profession, it was a caste, a culture, a way of existing in the world. An aging Mamluk who became a commander had spent decades obsessed with a single problem: how to be more lethal on horseback than the man in front of him. This collective obsession produced a level of expertise that simply didn't exist in military forces built any other way. The Mamluks' horse archery skills rivaled those of the Mongols. Their mobility was comparable. Their ability to read a battlefield in motion was comparable. When both armies faced off on an open field in equal numbers, the Mamluks were perhaps the only force in the world that wouldn't be automatically destroyed. But the Mongols had 20,000 horsemen. The Mamluks had 12,000. Numerical equality wasn't the scenario. The Mamluks had to find a way to make their 8,000-man disadvantage completely irrelevant. They had to find a way to turn the Mongols' greatest advantage, the feigned retreat, the very tactical system that had destroyed every army that tried to face them, into a weakness. And there was one man among the Mamluks who knew exactly how to do that. A man who understood the enemy better than any other living soul. Baybars was born a Cuman, not Egyptian, not Arab, not Persian. Cuman, a son of the exact same steppes that had produced the Mongol warriors. When he was just a boy, he was captured or sold. Historical records vary on the details and began the journey that would forge him into a general. The Mamluk system took him in, trained him, and Baybars proved to be extraordinary. He rose through the military ranks with the speed of someone whose mind worked differently than most. Other warriors sought victory through direct confrontation. Baybars sought understanding first. Before every engagement, he wanted to understand the enemy, not just how they fought, but why they fought that way. What underlying assumptions drove their decisions, where those assumptions made them blind. But what separated Baybars from the other Mamluk generals wasn't just martial skill. It was a mind that studied enemies instead of fearing them. Where others saw the Mongols as a force of nature, something to be endured or avoided, not confronted, Baybars saw them as a system built on principles. And principles can be manipulated. There was something else in Baybars's history that made him entirely unique in that moment. At some point in his life before the battle, he had spent time as a fugitive in the region of Palestine. This wasn't some trivial geographical coincidence. It meant that Baybars knew the valley of Ain Jalut, the terrain, the surrounding hills, the narrow passes, how the light fell at different times of day, not from a map, but with his own 2 feet. He had walked that land. He had slept in those hills. He knew the valley not the way a general studies a map before a battle, but the way a fugitive knows the terrain that kept him alive. That knowledge was irreplaceable, because in a battle where every single advantage would have to be artificially manufactured, mastering the terrain was the very foundation upon which everything else would be built. But Baybars had more. He had inside knowledge of Mongol doctrine. He knew that when the Mongols saw an enemy retreating, they gave chase. He knew that when they chased, they broke formation. He knew that the very tactic that had annihilated so many armies could be turned against its creators, but only if you had the ability to execute a feigned retreat convincing enough to fool the people who had been using it for decades. That required a very specific kind of warrior. Not someone just pretending to run away from a distance. Someone who could make the retreat look real because they had grown up learning those exact same maneuvers. Someone the Mongols would never suspect was putting on an act. Someone like Baybars. Baybars didn't just know the terrain. He had a plan that had never been attempted in the entire history of Mongol warfare. A plan that would use the Mongols' own system as the weapon to destroy them. In 1260, the world had run out of options. That's not an exaggeration. It's the geopolitical reality of that year. The Mongols under Kitbuka, one of Hulagu Khan's trusted generals, were in the Levant and advancing south. What had been the heart of the Islamic world, Baghdad, the Caliphate, Damascus, was destroyed or in enemy hands. And now the direction was clear. Egypt was next. The Crusader states on the coast watched with that particular kind of political terror that strikes pragmatists calculating whether it was safer to cooperate or resist, having already seen what happened to those who resisted. In the end, they stood aside. They offered no resistance to the Mamluk army passing through their territory heading north. It was the absolute maximum cooperation they could offer. Egypt was next. This wasn't speculation. Kitbuka had sent messengers to the Mamluk Sultan demanding submission. The language of the messengers was the language the Mongols always used with those they were about to conquer, not a negotiation, but a notification. And inside Egypt, the scenario was one of extreme instability. The Mamluk Sultanate was steeped in a succession crisis. Sultan Qutuz had come to power in a controversial manner. Baybars, who had been a senior general, had personal reasons for friction with Qutuz. There was bad blood between them, politics, tension dating back to previous events. But the two men were smart enough to understand one thing. If the Mongols reached Egypt, there would be no sultanate left to fight over. There would be no power to seize. There would only be the same ashes that had replaced Baghdad. Necessity unified what politics had divided. Qutuz and Baybars marched together. The Mamluk army advanced north, toward Palestine, toward the territory the Mongols already controlled. Fighting wasn't an option the Mamluks chose out of ambition or glory. It was the only thing standing between them and extinction. Surrender meant subjugation, and the Mongol track record with subjugated peoples was well documented enough that no one harbored any illusions about what that meant in practice. And facing these odds, facing an enemy that had never lost, facing a significant numerical disadvantage, Baybars made a very specific and calculated decision about where to fight. Not where he could survive, where he could win. And the place he chose was going to turn every Mamluk disadvantage into a trap and every Mongol advantage into a weakness. The selection of Ain Jalut as the battlefield was no accident. It wasn't the result of two forces stumbling into each other in the wrong place. It was a deliberate choice, the result of Baybars applying decades of warfare knowledge and a personal mastery of the terrain to create the conditions that made victory possible before the first rider even charged. The Ain Jalut Valley, Goliath's Spring in Arabic, the place where tradition says David killed Goliath, was narrow. Hills flanked it on both sides. This was crucial because Mongol power relied on space for flanking wings to spread out, space for the feigned retreat to create enough distance for the enemy to pursue without suspicion, space for reserve units to circle around into ambush positions. In a narrow valley, that space vanished. The 20,000 Mongol cavalrymen would be compressed, forced to fight on a narrow front where their numerical advantage was drastically reduced. But there was more. Baybars had studied the valley's orientation relative to the rising sun. In September, at dawn, the sun rose in the east in a way that bathed the valley in direct light, and if the Mongol army advanced from east to west, as the terrain suggested they would be riding straight into the rising sun. For horse archers, this was devastating. Vision is compromised. The ability to aim is compromised. The human eye, even when trained, cannot compensate for a low sun directly in its line of sight. Baybars positioned the battle to happen in exactly that orientation. The narrow terrain would destroy their space. The rising sun would destroy their vision. Two factors that no Mongol general had ever needed to consider before, because no enemy had ever chosen the battlefield with this level of precision. But there was still a third layer, the one nobody saw coming. Then came the core architecture of the plan. The main Mamluk force, the bulk of the 12,000 warriors, would be hidden in the hills surrounding the valley, out of sight, undetectable by the Mongol advance. They would wait. Baybars would lead a smaller, visible force enough to look like a real army, small enough to look vulnerable. This force would be the bait. They would engage the Mongols head-on. They would fight with enough intensity to seem genuine, and then, at the exact right moment, they would begin to fall back. And in the hidden lines in the hills, besides the concealed Mamluk cavalry, there was something else. Something no Mongol army had ever encountered before. Something Baybars had positioned with calculated precision for the moment the Mongols were most vulnerable. The midfa, primitive hand cannons using gunpowder. These weren't the cast-iron cannons that would dominate battlefields centuries later. They were metal tubes or reinforced bamboo, loaded with granulated gunpowder and improvised projectiles, fired with a lit match. Detonation was wildly inaccurate. Range was severely limited. Their ability to kill armored soldiers was modest at best. The technology was new, crude, and still far from the maturity that would make it decisive in other contexts. But Baybars had identified something in this rudimentary technology that turned its flaws into advantages. It wasn't meant to kill riders. It was meant to terrify horses. The trap was set. All that was left was to make the Mongols walk right into it. The Battle of Ain Jalut began exactly as Baybars had planned, with the Mongols advancing with the confidence of 40 years of invincibility. Kitbuka, the Mongol general, was a seasoned commander. He had spent decades executing the doctrine that had shattered empires. He had seen armies larger than the one he faced now crumble before the Mongol might. The idea that these warriors in front of him, 12,000 of them, against his 20,000, posed a genuine threat likely never crossed his mind the way it should have. Baybars's force advanced to meet them, smaller, visibly outnumbered. The initial engagement was intense. Baybars had made sure of it. Mamluk and Mongol warriors clashed in a fight that, to any observer, looked like a real battle. Arrows filled the air. Cavalrymen collided. The roar of battle echoed through the valley. And then Baybars began to fall back. Not a panicked collapse. A retreat, orderly enough to suggest intent, yet chaotic enough to make it look like the line was breaking. Exactly what a collapsing enemy line looked like when the Mongols had seen it dozens of times before. The Mongols pursued. Of course they did. It was what they always did. It was what always worked. Kitbuka was seeing exactly what he had seen dozens of times before. An enemy army disintegrating under Mongol pressure, soldiers turning their horses in a panic, the line breaking. The logic of 40 years of invincibility told him this was victory unfolding. The chase was merely the final act. But then something happened that threatened to destroy the plan before it could even work. In the hills surrounding the valley, some Mamluk warriors from the main force had watched the battle begin. And now they were seeing their own commander, Baybars, the architect of the entire plan, running, fleeing. To these warriors who didn't know the full details of the strategy, the scene unfolding before them could only mean one thing. They were losing. A few began to charge down from the hills. Discipline was breaking down. What happened next is one of the most dramatic images of the battle. Baybars, according to historical accounts, turned his horse around. In the middle of a feigned retreat, with Mongol cavalry in hot pursuit right behind him, he rode back toward his own troops, who were rushing down the hills, screaming at them to get back into position. Not as a victory cheer, as a command. As a commander re-establishing control at the single moment when control was absolutely critical. The line held. It's hard to overstate just how much this moment depended on Baybars's personal authority. This wasn't a general barking orders from afar. This was the architect of the battle himself, in the midst of a mock retreat, under the very real pressure of pursuit, turning his horse to face his own men and restore discipline through sheer force of presence. Any failure in that moment, any hesitation, any sign that he himself was unsure, and the whole plan would have unraveled. The men on the hills would have poured down, the element of surprise would have been lost, and the tactical advantage built with such painstaking care would have evaporated in seconds. But the line held, and the plan carried on. The Mongols kept pushing into the valley, chasing what appeared to be a fleeing enemy. Every meter they advanced drew them deeper into the trap. The narrow terrain Baybars had chosen now funneled the Mongol advance. They couldn't fan out to the wings as they normally would. The morning sun rising in the east blinded their vision. And up ahead, Baybars's force kept falling back, always keeping a precise distance, just out of reach, but close enough to make the chase irresistible. The main Mamluk force in the hills held their ground. They waited. The Mongols were deep inside the trap, and then the second element was triggered, the one no one had seen coming. The sound of the midfa was unlike anything a warhorse had ever heard before. It wasn't the hiss of an arrow. It wasn't the dull thud of a catapult payload. It was an explosion, sudden, deafening, accompanied by smoke and the stench of sulfur. For a human being, after the initial shock, it was possible to process it, categorize it, and keep functioning. But for a warhorse, even a trained horse, even a horse that had charged into actual battles, the response was entirely different. The horses panicked. This might sound like a minor detail. It's not. To understand why the Midfey were so decisive at that exact moment, you have to understand what a Mongol cavalry army actually was. It was a system of highly coordinated movements. Every single maneuver, the charge, the flanking, the feigned retreat, the encirclement, relied on riders controlling their mounts with pinpoint precision, executing movements in unison, and maintaining specific distances and rhythms. The Mongol cavalry was effective because it was choreographed. It operated as a single organism, not just a cluster of individuals. When the horses panic, that choreography collapses. Riders who had spent their entire lives in perfect sync with their animals suddenly lost control. Horses that had been trained for years not to break under the noise of conventional warfare were now shattering the lines, kicking and thrashing against the impossible sound. Cavalrymen trying to hold their ground were thrown off. Riders attempting to regroup couldn't, because their horses simply wouldn't obey. The Mongol formation, the very same rigid structure that needed to stay intact for their entire tactical doctrine to work, was collapsing from the inside out. And in a moment of brutal precision, the Midfey weren't killing massive numbers of Mongol warriors. They were doing something more important. They were shattering their coordination. They were turning 20,000 organized horsemen into a mass of disoriented individuals on unfamiliar terrain, with the sun in their eyes, riding horses that no longer responded to commands. Kitbuka tried to regroup. He tried to restore order. But the cascade had begun, and there was no stopping it. The Mongol system needed cohesion to function. Without cohesion, the 20,000 cavalrymen were simply 20,000 individual problems trying to survive in the wrong valley. The trap was complete. The killing blow would come next. The main Mamluk force descended from the hills like a wall. For the Mongol horsemen in the valley, it must have been a special kind of horror. The realization, in mere seconds, that the battle they thought they were winning had been an illusion all along, that the retreat they had chased was a setup, that the very ground they stood on was a cage, and that now, with their horses in a panic and their formation broken, the army that had been hiding in the hills was coming down to finish what the plan had started. The Mongols were manhunters with decades of experience. They knew the difference between a real retreat and a feigned one. They had executed the latter enough times to recognize the former. But in that moment, with the Midfa having destroyed their cohesion and the hills opening up to reveal the hidden army, the distinction no longer mattered. The battle turned into a rout. Kitbuka, the general who had led the Mongol advance, was captured. Historical accounts describe him dying with the dignity the Mongols expected of their commanders, without begging, without surrendering. But die he did. Hulagu Khan's general, the leader of the force that thought it was conquering Egypt, was executed in the very valley he had entered as a conqueror. The Mamluks didn't stop when the Mongols broke. Baybars had understood something that many generals ignore. A battle half won is merely a postponement. The fleeing Mongols, if allowed to regroup, could become the core of a new force. The pursuit was relentless. Mamluk cavalry hunted down the fugitives far beyond the valley of Ayn Jalut to ensure there would be no regrouping, no rallying, no chance for the shattered army to rebuild itself. The force of 20,000 horsemen from the Mongol Ilkhanate was effectively annihilated. When the news reached Hulagu Khan, who had left for other campaigns to the north, leaving Kitbuka in command, the reaction was disbelief, and then fury. But fury alone couldn't rebuild an annihilated army. It couldn't resurrect a dead general. It couldn't undo what had happened in that valley in September 1260. The deadliest horde in the world had been stopped. For the first time in 40 years, a Mongol army had been defeated in open battle in a permanent, definitive way. Not just pushed back, destroyed. And now comes the question that should have been asked from the very beginning. What exactly stopped the Mongols? Because the answer isn't what you expect. What happened in the weeks and months following Ayn Jalut was just as important as the battle itself. The Mamluks advanced north immediately. Damascus, which had fallen to the Mongols without resistance, was retaken. Syria, which the Mongol advance had swept through, returned to Mamluk control. The effect was both political and psychological. The narrative of Mongol invincibility that had paralyzed resistance for decades had been shattered publicly, in open battle, by an army that had decided to fight when every rational calculation suggested they couldn't win. And then something remarkable happened. The Mongols didn't come back. This needs to be stated clearly, because history sometimes downplays what it means. The Mongol Ilkhanate, one of the branches of the largest empire in the world, which had destroyed Baghdad, sacked Damascus, and annihilated armies for decades, did not launch another serious campaign to the west. Later attempts to retake the Levant were repelled by the Mamluks in other engagements, but none came close to replicating the force that had marched on Ayn Jalut. What Ayn Jalut prevented is one of history's greatest counterfactual questions. If the Mongols had won, if they had continued their advance south and west, North Africa wouldn't have had a comparable military force to resist them. Europe, which had survived the incursions of 1241, more due to the luck of the Mongol retreat, caused by the death of a great Khan, than any effective defense, would have faced that same horde, now more mature and more experienced, coming from the south. The world of 1300 or 1400 could have been unrecognizable compared to what actually happened. Ayn Jalut wasn't just a battle. It was the turning point where the Mongol expansion reached its permanent western limit. And the personal consequences were equally dramatic. Baybars, the architect of it all, the man who had designed the terrain, the plan, and the trap, didn't remain a subordinate for long. Under circumstances that historians describe with precision but some moral discomfort, Sultan Qutuz was assassinated shortly after Ain Jalut. Baybars became Sultan. He founded a dynasty. He ruled for decades, continuing to expand and consolidate Mamluk power. There was also a psychological shift that rippled through the Islamic world after Ain Jalut. For years, the idea that the Mongols could be stopped had seemed not just difficult, but conceptually impossible. The terror the Mongols deliberately cultivated had created a kind of collective paralysis. Even states with the resources to resist sometimes capitulated without a fight, because the very thought of victory against the Mongols simply didn't exist in the realm of possibility. Ain Jalut shattered that, not just militarily, but mentally. It proved that the Mongols bled, that they lost, that there was a way to defeat them if you knew where to look. In military history, Ain Jalut holds a unique place. It is the first documented example of an army that had studied the enemy's doctrine deeply enough to use that very doctrine as a trap. The feigned retreat, the maneuver that had decimated army after army, was executed against its creators by warriors who came from the same cultural background. It is the first recorded counter-tactic to the Mongol system. And it worked because one man had dedicated his entire existence to understanding exactly what would make that system fail. But the question that has lingered since the very first second of this video still needs an answer. We promised to reveal the secret weapon that stopped the deadliest horde in the world. And it did exist. It was just something that no one imagined. The Midfa were real. The terrain was real. The feigned retreat was real. Every element of that plan was indispensable. Without the narrow valley, the Mongols would have spread out along the flanks. Without the glare of the sun, the Mongol archers would have aimed freely. Without the convincing retreat, the Mongols wouldn't have pursued them to the point of vulnerability. Without the Midfa, the horses wouldn't have panicked, and the formation's cohesion wouldn't have collapsed. But none of these elements existed in isolation. Each depended on something that came before. And what lay at the root of every single one of them was the same thing: Baybar's knowledge. He knew the valley was narrow because he had lived in that region as a fugitive. He knew the sun would rise in that direction because he knew the terrain with his own eyes, not from a map. He knew the Mongols would chase a retreating force because he had grown up in the same cultural world that produced them. He knew how a steppe warrior reacts when he sees the enemy run, because he had felt that urge himself. He knew the horses would panic at the Midfa because he understood what makes a cavalry army vulnerable: the reliance on cohesion, the fragility of coordination when its animal foundation breaks. The secret weapon that stopped the Mongols was insider knowledge. Not abstract knowledge embodied, lived knowledge, earned through a lifetime of experience inside the very system that was being destroyed. That is what makes Ain Jalut unique, not just as a battle, but as a lesson. The lesson isn't that gunpowder beats cavalry. It isn't that terrain beats numbers. The lesson is that the only way to defeat a system is to understand it better than its own creators, to understand it from the inside, with the precision that only comes from having lived it well enough to see what they can't see, where it breaks, and how to make the breaking point look like a victory until it's too late to fix. Baybars saw where the Mongol system broke because he had lived in it. He had been shaped by the same world. He had internalized the same psychology, the same reflexes, the same assumptions that made a steppe warrior give chase when he saw an enemy run. He knew that the confidence of 40 years of invincibility didn't make the Mongols invincible. It made them predictable. And predictability, in the hands of someone who understands it from the inside, is a weakness as real as any flaw in a suit of armor. On September 3, 1260, in a valley in Palestine, a former Cuman slave used what he knew, not what he had, not what he commanded, but what he understood to stop the seemingly unstoppable. It wasn't the story you thought you knew, and the world was never the same. If this story changed how you see what makes someone truly dangerous on a battlefield, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. We have many more stories like this, battles where the decisive factor was something no one imagined, and a single man saw what everyone else failed to see.